G'day guys, it's the Aussie Engineer here. If you were like me and followed the news of the Raspberry Pi and its alternatives, you would have seen news recently on the URNE Pi, a Polish clone of the Raspberry Pi. Today I'm going to do some analysis on the available info to confirm whether this is something you should care about or not. Alright, first, let's have a look at the board from the images that have been put out from the developer. We can see straight off the bat that the board has a Rockchip RK3566, and we'll have a look at the specs of this in a minute. Next, and moving up to the slight right of that, we can see that the board has a Samsung 8GB eMMC 5.1 chip. Noting there's nothing overly remarkable about this other than it gives you onboard storage. The board still has an onboard micro SSD slot on the back of it. Moving along to the next thing that really sticks out to me is the M.2 slot, which is M-Key. This would indicate to me, and as almost a standard thing, an M-Key indicates that it's designed for an NVMe rather than a SATA slot, although the notes for the board say that it is a SATA-PCIe slot. For reference, generally SATA M.2s are B plus M keys. Now, because of that, I dug into the RK3566's data sheets a little bit more, just to confirm what is likely going on there. The RK3566 supports a SATA at version 3.3 up to 6 gigabytes, and has one PCIe 2.1 lane and a maximum transfer of 5 gigabits per second. So what this actually means is, due to there only being a single PCIe lane, it actually makes more sense to run a SATA M.2 drive due to speed and cost, because SATA drives generally are cheaper, and the single PCIe lane will not run faster than what the SATA will be able to. So personally, I'm not actually 100% sure as to why they have decided in this instance, based upon that, the chip in the board, to M-Key slot this and indicate that it runs PCIe as well as SATA. Personally, I'm actually a big fan, and I'll talk about it a little bit later in the summary. I'm a big fan of small boards like this that have a standard SATA output. So you can run a 3.5 either SSD or a 3.5 standard HDD. Anyway, moving along, if you look up into the top left of the board, it has a bit that's marked as the Wi-Fi antenna. This is actually an antenna plug, not the actual antenna. And this board, by the look of it, looks like it will require an external antenna. This both has benefits and weaknesses. Key of those being, you can put a bigger antenna on it, you can position it better, but you actually have to have one mounted. The last thing I note when I look at the board straight off the bat is that it has a standard sized, full-size HDMI slot. I'm a really big fan of having full-size HDMIs on these things. It does mean, however, that you can't have, like the Pi, 2 micro HDMI ports on it. So you can't run dual displays off this sort of board. But honestly, if I'm looking at running dual displays, generally I'm not looking at running hardware like a Pi. So moving on, let's have a look at what the actual tech specs are. And I'll just give you a quick second to absorb before I go into that, noting my head is in the way of the GPU, the integrated graphics. Some really important things to pull out of this straight off the bat is that the A72 is a larger, more powerful core. However, the A55 is a better performing core, and partly that is down to the ISA version that it runs, running 8.2, not 8. And that is 100% marked straight in the actual Geekbench 4 scores, where the A55 will outperform an A72 core. I'm not able to confirm why the Geekbench 5 scores are performing lower for the A55 cores, and that's something I've got to look into. And in the future, when I get my hand on one of these boards, I will personally rerun these tests to confirm what the actual differences are. But for me, what is probably more important for these use cases is the Geekbench 4 scores, where the Rockchip RK3566 does outperform the Broadcom BCM 2711. So, moving on to some availability, because availability is really, really big for me. At the moment, the URNE Pi is available through one site that I've been able to find at the price of $90 US. It's not on eBay, and eBay for me a lot of the time is a really good indication of how far things have spread out in their overall popularity, because once something becomes popular, it'll start to get scalped. And in fact, at the moment, if you're looking at trying to find a Pi 4, you'll pretty much only find it through scalpers at about double the price of what the URNE Pi is currently going for. Whether that will change, I'm not 100% sure. I guess for both is a bit concerning. For me, if something is a really good product, it will obviously spread out to eBay and start being scalped as a sign that it is a very strong product. However, that hasn't happened, and obviously it really is not great at the moment that you just can't get Pi 4s unless you're paying significantly more than the $30 to $35 to $40 sort of MSRP that the low-end boards were meant to be coming out at. So, in short, where do I see this sitting? Is this something you should really be considering? And at the moment, I'm going to say if we're comparing MSRPs, this is, significantly more expensive than what a comparable Pi 4 would be for what would be not a huge step up in performance. And the reason I say this, and looking at those, I guess those raw bits, is if the Pi was currently selling, for the one gig RAM version for $35 or slightly more for the other versions, we wouldn't be having this conversation at all. This board would just not make sense whatsoever. And there's a lot of other boards out there in the market which are exactly the same. You wouldn't be having a conversation about them because they cost more than the Pi. And one of the things that the Pi has over all of these other boards at the moment is it has a massive community. So when it comes to actual use of the Pi, you'll generally find it's going to be better supported both in terms of its actual, from the Pi side itself, plus the community is a hell of a lot better. So you're going to find videos to show if you're having problems with different software, different applications, different use cases. You're probably going to find that someone's tried to use a Pi 4 in a similar way and has found solutions to the problems, whether a small, I won't say niche, but a small clone board, you're probably not going to have that same level of support there out in the community. And for me, it would have to be really, really unique, powerful, doing things for a specific use case that I had that a Pi can't do before I'd look at switching over to one of these alternative boards. The next bit I will point out is like the M.2 drives. So for me, is it great that a board has an M.2 slot on it? Yes. If it's PCIe NVMe, I would say then it's worth putting potentially an M.2 drive onto it. But where it's single lane, not for 2 or 4 lanes in particular, it starts to lose some of that value to me. So, and in this case, looking purely at the spec side of the house, it makes more sense to stick a SATA M.2 into this board slot than it does to stick an NVMe one, purely because you're not accessing any higher speed. So it's not worth paying the additional price that you're going to pay to go from SATA to NVMe. Now, if that's the case, as I said earlier, when you're talking about SATA off these sort of boards, I'd prefer to have a SATA out, so standard SATA out, so I can run a 3.5, a 2.5 HDD or SSD off it. Number one, because an M.2 slot will not give you an HDD, the capability to run HDD off it. Why would I see that as important? Well, potentially it's down to use cases. So if you're putting a M.2 slot on it and you want it to run a fast operating system, that's great. Works for me. Boot drive, stuff that needs to be accessed very quickly, 100% M.2 NVMe makes sense. SATA HDD makes sense to me for storage and backup type applications. So you can get, obviously, HDD still a lot cheaper and a lot better suited to, for example, an NVR or backing up files where the speed doesn't need to be above 6 gigabits per second because you're unlikely to even saturate that if you're, backing up files from your phone onto one of these things. Then an HDD on SATA is probably a good enough solution. And even so, if not that, then an SSD, a standard 2.5-inch SSD, is probably going to do the trick at potentially a cheaper price. But anyway, these are just things to consider. I would still, noting that the Pi 4 is incredibly difficult to get and impossible to get at MSRP, noting that, I would still probably go for a Pi 4 just because of the community support, and it's going to be easier to do stuff when it comes to software. And there's nothing that I can see on this board which grabs me that hard that I would migrate away from that non-support. Recommend this product? Well, unfortunately, until I can get one in my hands, I don't want to recommend it. But as soon as I do, I'll update this review to sort of indicate whether this is something you should invest in or not. Anyway, guys, have a great day and stay safe out there.